Carl?
Hi guys, welcome back to the pit. Today I'm going to show you how I built this medical center tile for my Zombicide board.
What is this?
A center for ants?
No, not quite, Derek. Here is the tile that I based the project on, and it appears to be some kind of medical facility. For inspiration, I had a look through a few photos of medical facilities found throughout the United States, and decided to model the building off an urgent care. I liked this one in particular and used it as my main example. After a bit of research, I decided to create the building's facade with a projected entrance on the far right side, a glass door, a tile panel at the bottom, and crown mouldings at the top. But that was enough messing around, it was time to get building, and I started off by building the facade. So the first thing I did was grab my favourite construction material, a sheet of 6mm AK construction foam. I cut out the projected entrance section of the facade as well as the door. I then cut out the entire length of the facade, which was a little shorter than the entrance section, and cut out the door in a position that would perfectly align with the entrance section. I then cut out some thick card to be the building's door jamb and glued them in place. Next I needed to build the tile panel, which I modelled on the one pictured here. I achieved this look using JTT styrene concrete block sheets. I first cut strips of the sheet that were 2.5cm tall and the length of the facade, including the corner of the projected entrance. I then glued the strips together. I then fixed down a narrow evergreen strip to the top of the panel to act as the panel's moulding. Then I moved on to the crown moulding. I started by cutting strips of polystyrene sheets that were 2.5cm high and the length of the facade. I then used styrene flat strips and glued them to the top of the mouldings, and then glued down a narrower, squarer strip on top of that to complete the decorative look. However, before I glued these down, I had to create the facade's brickwork. I've covered this process many times in my previous videos, but I'm always evolving my technique, so I'll cover it again. I started by painting the building white so I could actually see what I was doing. I wish these still came in blue. I then marked out the brick pattern very lightly using a pencil. And cut very shallow lines along the pattern using a hobby knife. I then went back over the lines with the pencil, this time pressing a bit harder to create shallow mortar lines. I then cut a slot at the back and sides of the facade for the rear walls to fit into. I made these about 10cm high, a few millimeters deep, and the same width as the foam board I planned to use for said walls. I then painted the wall red, and once that was dry, I mixed equal parts white and grey pigment, a splash of water, and a blob of PVA glue to create a mortar wash. I applied this to the brickwork and allowed it to dry, and then dry brushed the brickwork with a mix of red and white paint. Next, I shaded random bricks bright red, dark brown, and light brown. I then reapplied a much more watered down version of the mortar wash in order to blend the brick shading. And finally, I applied a very watered down dark or black wash. Then I painted the moulding and tile panels, gave them a wash, and then a highlight and shading. And glued them on. my videos. For more info on this, please check out the video displayed here. I then fixed some needles to the top of the door. And slid the door into position using the needles to help fix the door into place. I then cut clear plastic for each panel of the door and glued them into place, making sure a few of the panels were broken. Once that was done, I glued the door into place. Next it was time to build the front sign. I then printed out a sign the exact size I wanted the final lettering to be, and cut each letter out individually using a hobby knife. I then glued these letters onto a piece of styrene card. And cut them out again. I then soaked the styrene lettering in water to remove the glue and paper, and used very narrow styrene strips to make the lettering 3D. I did this by cutting and gluing the strips along the sides of the lettering. I often had to bend the strips across the contours of each letter. And then I painted the sign, as well as some porch lights from a Rubicon kit. Again, I used the same chipping technique. I then glued the sign and lights down into position. And dabbed them with a rough sponge and rust pigment to give them a weathered look. And then I used the same pigment to create some rust streaks from the sign. I also created some grime streaks on the cornice moulding and attached some shrubbery. And then it was time to reuse some of my street knowledge.
Guess where you just got into? Cool guy zone.
I added some simple graffiti with paint pens and used a fine brush to create some streak marks while the paint was still wet. Then a bit of soil pigment was added to various parts of the building. Finally, I added a more complex tag, using my airbrush for the background, a paint pen for the letter outline, and paint for the letter fill. I used various shades of blue to create a gradient within the letter fill. Now it was time to build the rear interior and exterior walls. I started with the exterior walls and cut 3 rectangles of foam core board, one piece the same width as the tile and 2 pieces the length of the tile from the back up to the sidewalk. Each piece was 10 centimeters tall. I then glued the 2 side wall panels onto the back wall panel. Next I cut out the interior walls, which was 6 centimeters high, and then I marked out the doors in the same positions as they appear on the tile. I made the doors 4 centimeters wide and 4.5 centimeters high. I then cut these doors out using a hobby knife. I then created door jambs using coffee stirrers, and then glued the interior walls together. Next, I cut 2mm wide strips of thin card to act as the door's architrave. I also used coffee stirrers to cap the interior walls, and used thin strips of timber to create the building's side skirts, and then sealed off any gaps using gap filler. After giving the interior a coat of white paint, I painted the side skirts and door frames dark grey, which added another entire day to the painting process.
It drives me nuts!
I then took some JTT styrene tile card and cut it out into the dimensions of the building's floor. I then glued that onto a piece of foam core board with the same dimensions. Once that was done, I painted, washed and shaded the floor tiles and glued it down onto the game tile. I then put the rear wall section of the building in position on the tile without gluing it down, and fixed it to the facade. This is to ensure that everything is glued into the correct position and that I wouldn't get any nasty surprises later. I then gave the interior walls of the building a light wash before fixing it down. However, before fixing the building down, I had to build the famous Cafeteria Door from the Walking Dead hospital scene. So I first cut out a thin 5x5cm piece of card, and then cut out a piece of thick card with the same dimensions. I then marked out a door frame on the thicker piece of card, cut it out and glued it onto the thinner card. Then I cut the remaining piece of card in half. This was to create a double door, which was also glued onto the thin card. Next I cut 2 small pull plate door handles using thin card, as well as 2 kick plates at the bottom of the door. Again, I bent 2 staples into door handles, which I fixed into place using superglue. I then painted the doors up using the same colours that was seen in The Walking Dead. Then I used a black paint pen to draw on the ominous words, "Don't open, dead inside." Seriously creepy shit. While the paint pen was still wet, I used a fine brush to create streaking and a bit of fuzziness around the edges of the lettering. I also added some bloody fingerprints around the edges of the 2 doors. I also created an improvised wooden latch or barricade. And then I created a chain using a necklace, which I spent an entire day searching cheap shops to find. I wrapped this around the door handles and tied both ends together using a small piece of wire and a small piece of plastic card fashioned into a padlock. Once this was complete, I glued it into place within the building. And then I could finally fix the building onto the tile. It was now time to create a bit of weathering and detailing on the tile's exterior. I added a bit more earth wash and painted up a barrel from a TT combat kit, as well as a few other components. I also painted up the flame that came with the TT combat kit, which would later be fixed to the top of the barrel. I used a series of washes and highlights to create a flame effect, and then painted a rough glow around the top of the barrel. Next, I used my airbrush and some black paint to create a smoke effect on the section of wall adjacent to the barrel, which was terrifying to say the least. I then used a yellow-green fluorescent paint to create a glow effect on the wall. I started off by highlighting the edges of the bricks and tiles. And then dry brushed outward from the center of the glow to create a subtle color gradient. I then fixed down a mailbox I'd painted earlier, the barrel, and a tire. Next, using washes, leaves, grass tufts, and other scatter material, I completed the tile's apocalyptic look. Then finally, it was time to create the interior weathering and detailing. With these 4 rooms, I decided to make a surgery/office, a hospital ward, a hallway, and a waiting/reception area. I started out, as I always do, by adding a dirty pigment wash. This time I went with a light grey to give the appearance of dust. I then broke open my hospital ward terrain crate by Mantic Games, which had pretty much everything you need in terms of furniture to create a hospital scene, including beds, desks, surgery trolleys, and much more. So I began the process of painting these components up. For a bit of extra detail, I printed out some miniature hospital signage and posters which I would fix to various walls and doorways throughout the building. I then glued down a dead medical staff member, which I got from a TT combat kit, and painted a pool of blood around his visible wounds. Then I wanted to recreate the scene around the cafeteria doorway from The Walking Dead. When examining the scene, it looks like much of the debris around the doorway is made up of broken ceiling tiles, as well as